All right. Can you guys hear me okay? Motorhead. Holy cow. That'd be a great show too. Motorhead, what a band. Curling Club. Wow. Must have been a while ago. Um, welcome to tonight's session. I hope you guys are all doing well. I'm still in Montreal, Quebec. I've heard it's smoking hot out in British Columbia for those of you that are in BC. That's the reports I've heard back from everybody at home. So 40 degrees in some cases I've heard in the interior, which is cooling this week. Okay, good. Yeah, it's crazy. 40 degrees. That's not good. We had a bit of a heat wave here a few weeks ago, but it's been pretty mellow. So tonight, I want to talk about something that relates to both courses, where we're at with both courses. And in 322, we're at that kind of integration of different perspectives or imperatives, as we're calling them in the course: ecological, economic, and social. And then in the 660, we're looking at product-related tools. And in both cases, what's really important to be successful at getting engagement with an idea, when you talk about engaging the different imperatives, and then also the idea of sustainability in relation to a product, is communicating that. So how do you communicate these things, right? So how do you influence people? How do you engage people? So what I had thought would be a useful thing to talk about tonight, certainly is useful because for me, because I'll tell you what I'm having to get up to next week. But I think it's useful for the course where we're at in both of the courses. So the title of tonight's lecture is Communication and Engagement: How do we represent integrated sustainability? I'm not going to get into details about integrated sustainability, but really, I mean, certainly in 322, we're talking about how do you kind of communicate multifaceted messages. So why this is important for me is, so I'm here until Sunday, and then Sunday morning, really early, I'm going to fly to St. Lucia in the Eastern Caribbean, which is a small island there where my team and I have been working on a project for the past, I guess, year and a half, maybe even 2 years, actually, a year and a half at least, where we've been designing a software platform, a national environmental information system, to help that country report to MEAs, multilateral environmental agreements. So like Canada, St. Lucia, and a lot of different nation states around the world, but in the Caribbean particularly, have signed on to these multilateral environmental agreements. And I've talked about them already. So the Convention for Biodiversity is a multilateral environmental agreement where you sign on and then you have obligations as a country to conserve biodiversity, then also promote sustainable use of ecosystems. UNFCCC is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that's the MEA that relates to how we deal with greenhouse gases in terms of mitigating our emissions, and then also adapting to climate change. So this project has been a pilot project. There's no other country that's really done anything like this, where we've designed this platform and looked at, audited their whole country for, what indicators need to be tracked for each MEA, and then also what the data that they have is that speaks to that. So for instance, like in one of the indicators is greenhouse gas emissions from different sectors. So are they tracking that in the reports they've done so far, and then in what format? And then we've designed a platform that they can enter all this data and upload these documents and so forth, focal points, and then the public can see it, and then they can quite easily report on this data, whereas typically it's a pretty cumbersome process. The reporting, it takes a long time. The data is all over the place, quite disorganized. There's no metadata, all that kind of stuff. And then it's not exactly what the UN wants. Whereas, so what we've been working on is working with the UN at the convention level, and then also the country at the ministry level. So Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, Sustainable Development, et cetera, to design this system that can help that situation out as a pilot. It's a for the world. Actually, it's a prototype for countries around the world, and so I'm happy with where it's at right now. We had a review today, and we're launching it next week on Tuesday. We have a big event, and it's a big deal. You know, all the government people and prime minister and so forth are going to be there. And so my job is to kind of communicate, because I've been leading the project, what it's about. But a big part of my job, because quite often these things get shifted to the side by the political people, but I have to go in there and explain to them the significance of this. And a big part of that is effectively communicating what this is all about and what the importance is for that country, especially with having the heads of state there. And I got to be able to do that well, because what it will mean is then, people will really engage with this platform and start to think seriously about it. They already do, but a big part of that is going to be trying to find the right messaging, right? So that's what I want to talk about tonight is communication. And this is a big part of a lot of different projects that I work on with my team and have been doing so for, whatever, 18 years, maybe more. So first off, it's the importance of communication. And the Latin root of the word communication is communis, which, if you translate that directly, it means common ground or common opinion. So when we're talking about communication, therefore, what we really are, in essence, attempting to bring people to come to some sort of common understanding through transmission and then the reception of information. That's really what communication is. A very simplified definition of communication. You can do a PhD thesis on communication if you wanted to, but this is the working definition we have tonight. So this simplifies the process, as there's a lot of various different dimensions. There's different kind of ways people perceive information. There's different kind of modalities of communicating it. Some people are more visual, oral, tactile, sensory, what have you. But in essence, this is really the core of what we're trying to do, and it's quite important in our line of work to get to that core message. Say, okay, what really are we trying to do here is we're trying to come to some sort of common understanding about an issue between two parties or multiple parties. So sustainability and communication. Well, we have a variety of different issues pertaining to sustainability that we need to communicate. So I've mentioned in both of the courses, like in 660, in the case of product-related tools, what we're really trying to communicate is what the sustainability of different products could be if they have different tools that are used in order to create them. So, for instance, life cycle assessment or eco-certification or these kind of things that we're looking at. So that's that's one of the things that needs to be communicated and communicated quite well. In 322, when we talk about, say, integrating the social, ecological, and environmental imperatives or economic imperatives, I mean, that's more of an idea, right? So you're communicating an approach to the world or to policy. So some issues may resonate, and there's a lot of different angles to that one. Like, so product-related tools, I mean, there's a kind of a fixed number of things you might be communicating. Whereas when we talk about reconciling the imperatives of economic versus ecological versus social, I mean, there's a lot of different things that fall within that problem, right? So some issues may resonate more with other people than others. So for instance, there may be some people that are more biological conservation oriented and so forth. So you kind of need to really pick your battles. The timing may be important. When you're looking at communicating a certain issue pertaining to sustainability, timing will be important because if it's, say, let's say in political sphere, if it's close to an election, situational communication, exact. Like, let's just say if you're, like what's happening here in Quebec right now is there's an election coming up provincially, and I mean, that's really dictating a lot of what's happening. There's a tremendous amount of money being spent in this province, whereas they'd been under how do you say, austerity measures for the last few years, basically. And now you see just like infrastructure being going up all over the place, and the reason being is what's being communicated there. Hey, looking for the people. That's what's happening, right? So timing is going to be very important in that. Context is going to be important as well. So what's happening not only in the timing of whatever the issue is you're having to deal with, but also in the cultural context. So Sean mentioned situational communication. That's exactly right. So you may be like I've been in this situation where in cross-cultural communication, my meeting next week, context is going to be very important. Why? Because I kind of know the way the government deals with this stuff, and I also understand, having been at the UN meetings for the past few weeks, that this is a huge deal in the UN world. There's not many other people doing this, so the context there, and you're dealing with this is the 180,000 people is the population of St. Lucia. That's a small country, right? It's not a lot of people, yet they're doing something that no one else is really doing effectively, right? So the contextual communication leverage point there is, hey, we're punching like 1,000 times above our weight as St. Lucia, as a small island developing state, being subject to pretty significant environmental issues. So the context there is to say, hey, look at what we're doing, and if we can do it, the world can do it, this kind of thing, and really kind of instilling a sense of pride in the part of the population. So that's one of the things I'm thinking about in terms of the preparation I'm doing now. So what will be consistent with will be the characteristics of the communication that will make it work. So regardless of timing, context, or situation, what will most likely make your communication successful is the characteristics of it and the methods that you employ in order to do it effectively. Okay, so given that, I want to introduce you to the work of two guys who have studied under a gentleman by the name of Malcolm Gladwell. Is everybody familiar? Anybody familiar with Malcolm Gladwell? Yes? So what's one of his books? What's the big one? Starts with T. If you're not familiar with Malcolm Gladwell, I'd check his stuff out. Tipping Point is the book I'm referring to. He's written another one called Blink. There's a few different ones. So what Malcolm Gladwell works on is kind of interesting social phenomenon, I guess you could say. Like Tipping Point was about where do some innovations just really kind of just cause fundamental shifts in society, like, I don't know, like DVDs, for instance, and so forth. But two of his students followed in that ilk around his kind of like the stuff that he looks at, which is like, why do things happen in society, essentially? And their name is the Heath brothers, Heath, and I got introduced to their work about 4 or 5 years ago by a very well-known criminal defense attorney in Ottawa, probably the best, and he was a mutual friend of a friend, and I was at a dinner party, and we started talking about what we do. Well, I knew what he did, and we're just talking about work, and he knew I was teaching, and then he mentioned this book that he used the techniques in for making compelling closing and opening arguments in court cases. So sticky communication. There we go, Malcolm. Okay, there's one, Malcolm Gladwell. So the idea there, though, and what this got me interested in was, okay, because he was using it to resonate with the jury. As a criminal defense or a prosecutor, you have a certain amount of time to convince a jury of your point, right? That's your job, right? Whether you're an advocate for someone who's being convicted, or whether you're speaking on the part of the Crown or the government or the public, you have to advocate, you have to communicate your case, right? So that got me very interested, because I thought, wow, that's super interesting. So I went and bought the book and I read it, and sure enough, it was a very interesting book and a lot of cool ideas and examples from since then. I was actually, probably must be 6 years ago, have used those techniques either tacitly, like unconsciously, or explicitly in presentations I do for work, or even in teaching. So what is sticky? So something that sticks is something that is memorable. So we all know examples of these things. So there's certain sayings out there, there's certain advertisements, there's songs, there's memes, there's all kinds of like ideas that tend to resonate. So these cultural bites that tend to resonate. But the thing is, they resonate for a reason. And so these two students of Malcolm Gladwell, what they did was they studied and deconstructed this phenomenon into its what they believe as the core elements that contributed to the stickiness of these ideas. So their book, here, this is a link here, and you can go to that on your own time and even take a look at the book if you want, is called Made to Stick. That's the name of the book, and it's basically about how to make ideas sticky or memorable. So they came up with this model which outlines 6 principles that they say contribute to making ideas sticky. So the first principle is simplicity. It's simple. So this is about finding the core of your message. So in our work, as we've seen already in both courses, like environmental management tools, there's an EIA has a heck of a lot of material to it. We have a lot of complicated issues or problems to address. You know, ecological degradation, climate change, sea level rise, gender inequality, poverty, invasive species, toxins in the environment, blah blah blah. I mean, the list goes on, right? So if you want to drown someone in communication, tell them the world is going to heck and so forth, I mean, it's quite easy to do that. You know, you've got there's not a shortage of material to work with. However, that won't work in our favor, right? So we cannot bombard people. And the key here is do not bombard your audience with all of the stuff that's going on in your project or in this issue you're dealing with. What you really need to do is distill down what the core message is in the given situation you're dealing with, right? So if it's greenhouse gases or something like that, then that's what the issue is going to have to be. You really have to distill it down. So it may mean limiting the scope of issues you deal with in order to leave them with that one message. It's a lot better to like distill down to the core thing that you want them to walk away with and leave them with that, than just bombard them with many issues and they walk away just like, okay, that was, I don't even know, like I don't know what they were trying to get at with that presentation. So a perfect example, I would say, of distilled, toned down communication that's probably arguably one of the most successful environmental campaigns that has ever been done is Earth Hour, right? It's simple. And you can argue, I mean, there's a lot of people that argue about, you know, whether it costs us and stuff like this. And the key is everybody gets it, right? Everybody gets Earth Hour. Turn the lights out, save electricity, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. End of story. Very easy. Very simple, but very powerful. So WWF, as I'm preparing this lecture, I know WWF fairly well, but their communications is really quite phenomenal. You know, they've done a heck of a lot of work, and whatever they do tends to be really, really good. You know, and Earth Hour is a very good example of that. That's their project, and it's a winner. Second principle, unexpected. So try and get the attention, attract your audience, right? Violate a schema, right? So throw something controversial in there, something that they don't anticipate, a non-expected situation, right? Here's an example that I came up with. Conservation will not work. We must use our resources, right? So imagine if you're giving that lecture or presentation in an environmental context. I mean, right off the bat, someone's go, "What are you talking about? Conservation will not work. We must use our resources. What are you, crazy?" And then you lead into a discussion about, well, sustainable use of natural resources, right? Which is exactly what a presentation that I attended with Jane Goodall gave at the UNFCCC conference, the COP conference in 2016 at the Global Landscapes Forum. I was at a session where she was presenting this new project in Africa of sustainable landscapes. And she was sending that message, which I was like just astounded by, because you associate Jane Goodall with conservation of habitat for orangutans or chimpanzees. And so it was non-intuitive, and I mean that's because one of the violate a schema, like twist the message such that you cause kind of what are you talking about? Like unexpected messaging. the next thing you need to consider in terms of the unexpected is to hold the attention of the audience with curiosity gaps, what they call curiosity gaps. Pose questions. What species is by far the healthiest on the planet? So that's something like, this is kind of combination of a violation of a schema and a curiosity gap, because rather than asking the audience here what species is in the most trouble, which is what you would expect to hear from an environmental presentation on conservation, it's like, well, what is a species that's doing absolutely fantastic in the world right now? We don't need any concern whatsoever. They're all good. They're just doing fine, right? What is it? Curiosity gap. Like, I don't know. Humans? What is it? I don't know. Like, you're creating that kind of intrigue, or trying to. Your audience has to be intrigued because you want them to want your message. And this is actually a problem that we run into in the environmental field quite a bit. I run into it. I run into it because I go to conferences and I hear the same old stuff. In fact, I heard it a lot at the UN conference here at the side events. Same old stuff. Same old stuff. I didn't want to hear much more of the messages by like the second or third day, because it was becoming predictable, right? I knew what they're going to say. We need more funding for this, that, and the other thing. Third principle, concrete. So make your message understandable. Make it relatable. Use sensory language, right? So you want to paint a mental picture for the audience that they can get. And this, again, is something that we can run into some problems in the environmental field, because sometimes we talk in abstraction, talking about ideas like resilience and sustainability and blah, blah, blah. Like, what does that mean? Like, what does sustainability mean to me? I work in the mine, and I have a family, and I do my job. And then you're presenting to me about this concept about sustainability, and you're not explaining to me exactly what it means for my life, or my family, or my community, or my future. It's not concrete to me. So you have to contextualize your situation and then communicate in a concrete way. Paint a mental picture. So one of the examples I use in the Heath's book is, we're going to put a man on the moon, right? That was the impetus for the massive surge or massive push for to get people into space. We want to put a man on the moon. Boom, people got it. People understood. We literally want to have someone walking on the moon, and not just mobilize people. So try and connect with multiple types of memory. Try and use vivid description, visuals of pristine nature, for instance. An example is like vivid pictures in the natural context, like this one here I gave this example. It never wears out. Is, why do people never tire of the image of the lone polar bear stranded on a tiny iceberg? Why? Because it's concrete and it's sticky. They get it. It's even emotive, right? Because they see this frail, you've seen the image of the small polar bear and that tiny iceberg just standing there like it's lost, right? And you can see it, and then you can relate to, oh, well, that's climate change, right? That's right there. We're stranding polar bears. But it works. It works. That's even a bad example, like scientifically, because there's a lot of issues around the polar bear issue there. But nonetheless, the communication around that is extraordinary, right? Get it right away. Your average person will look and say, wow, we're sure are doing damage to our planet. We've got to deal with climate change. Fourth principle, credibility. This, again, is another problem in our field, in our discipline, and I actually see this a lot. It's essential in our business. It's essential for you as an environmental professional to communicate with credibility, because if you don't, then you are no longer considered to be or perceived an environmental professional, right? And that's just the reality of it. So if you don't have credible stuff to say, then, okay, well, what do you, thank you very much, but I thought you were the professional. I thought you were the expert, right? So I see there's an immense amount of hyperbole on both sides of these arguments out there in the world. So I see a lot of kind of lack of credibility on both sides. I see that the green has a tendency to exaggerate claims and sometimes misrepresent issues. I see it, on occasion, where things are like I'll give you an example, is a lot of ecosystem valuation data and like a payment for ecosystem services or this kind of thing. At least it used to be, not so much now because it's gotten better, but it used to be so incredibly exaggerated. Like the figures were so astronomically huge in many cases that these studies and presentations I went to came out to policy that people in policy said, "Well, this is incredible. This is crazy. I can't take it seriously." Right? So they lost their credibility. On the other side of the equation, we have the pro-development community does the opposite. So they paint anyone who opposes development as an eco-freak or, as you may remember, an un-Canadian terrorist in some cases, right? So again, it's an emotive response without a lot of credibility. So credibility comes either from outside or from within, right? So outside credibility is from authorities validating the idea. So for instance, in my stuff that I work on, in fact, this presentation next week, why is this system and the project taken so seriously that everybody's going to be there next week for this presentation? It's because it's the UN is the executing agency and the funding body is the GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, and then we're doing the project. Right? Instant authority. The UN is the executing agency. Boom, you have it right there. So we work with the UN in many cases. There is an automatic sense of security and belief because of the perceived authority of the UN. And this is a great example of it next week's presentation and meeting. Human scale statistics and vivid details can also help to realize credibility from the inside standpoint. So give like credible, reasonable statistics that are valid, and then also descriptive detail of the issue that you're dealing with. And that can help to kind of reassure your audience that what you're saying is legitimate. It's understandable. I can visualize it. I can see it. It makes sense. Principle number 5 is emotional. So people care quite often about people and they don't care about numbers, right? So if you're trying to, say if you're doing a presentation to a group of people about, say, climate change, people will care about the impacts of climate change on society, on communities, and on nature. They won't care about the tons of CO2 in the atmosphere or the amount of degrees of increase or change in temperature, right? I mean, yes, but even like when I'm at these events, we talk about, well, we can't reach this degrees or that degrees. I'm like, okay, well, I lose track sometimes. I'm like, well, what is it? It's 1.5 or 2. What's the goal now? Let's keep below 1.5, Whereas when you see the human impact of some of these issues, like say, for instance, the communities that are in coastal Bangladesh or coastal Guyana and so forth are facing basically impending destruction of their communities and society. And that is something I care about. Like most people can't help but care about that because they can visualize it. They can see the real impact of it. Current heat wave gripping northern hemisphere. Exactly. Perfect example. See, this is causing a lot of discussion in the media about climate change, right? We had 60 people in Montreal die, I think. It was a really high number. I have to double check that. I had a conversation at the grocery store the other day. We had a very significant amount of people died during the heat wave in Montreal. And a lot of that had to do with people being stranded in rooms or not being cared for they didn't have the proper air conditioning installed, right? So remember WIFI, what's in it for you? What is the takeaway or implication for the audience? What do you want to leave them with? How can you make it relate to them, right, at an emotional level? Your next generation, your children are going to be living in a world where we don't have winter anymore. I don't know. I'm just making that up, but see what I'm saying? Like you're then kind of pulling that back to the audience and making it personally relevant. And self-interest can often be superseded. So given that, so WIFI is powerful. What's in it for you? What impacts on you? But that self-interest can often be superseded by identity appeals, right? So, and by identity appeal, I mean appealing to an idea of an identity you may ascribe to. So here's an example. The Canadian thing to do is to be an environmental leader, right? Why? Well, because we're Canadian, right? We have trees, we have forests, we have lakes, we have a lot of nature, therefore we're an environmental leader. We should be. That's what defines us, right? That's kind of an identity appeal. Principle 6, stories. So this is the last principle. Stories drive action through simulation. So what to do, like what's the moral of the story, like this is what we should do, and also inspiration and motivation to do it. So if you can paint a picture through story about what the issue is and what you should be doing, and then how to, and why you should do it, then you're going to be, you're going to be able to make some progress. And paint a picture through a story of how an existing situation can change, right? So this is a very powerful technique. In fact, some argue that the story is the key to knowledge transmission and management. Like that's there's a school of thought around that. So story. So how do we most often share memorable ideas? Well, if you think about it, knowledge transmission society is often done through story. Stories, myths, fables, even jokes. These are narratives that capture and transmit ideas, and in many cases, powerful messages, powerful moral fables. So like Aesop's fables, Greek mythology, First Nations oral histories and tales. Many of these have very serious moral messages that are embedded in different stories, right? And Greek mythology is laden with stories and myths, but they carry certain meanings, certain things we draw out and lessons learned as a result. So from an analytical standpoint, you could say knowledge management is rooted in narrative. So I'm not going to go far into this, but I want to mention it because I think it's important for you to be aware of this work. So one of the most eminent thinkers in knowledge management is a guy named Dr. Dave Snowden. And I don't know if anybody know of him or have read his work. You may have, grad students may have read of Snowden stuff if you looked at leadership or management theory. So one of the more, he argues that narrative is intrinsic to organizational knowledge transmission, right? So for example, like if you want to find out what the true story of what's going on in an organization, Dave Snowden say, well, this is what you do. If you want to really know what's going on in an organization, go and hang out near the water cooler and be a fly on the wall. And you will hear through narrative stories of what's going on there and what the dynamics are and so forth. So he's formulated his theory into a model, what he calls Cynefin. Yes, the Cynefin guy, exactly. As it relates to decision making in organizations. So Cynefin framework is more about decision making, but communication and knowledge transmission, I think, has a big role to play in his thoughts. And so that's why I think take a look at his stuff. It's a complexity model, and a communication and understanding is a complex system. So communication and successful communication is a complex system. It's a complex problem. Trying to find that common ground, as I referred to previously, the Latin root of communication being communis, between different stakeholder groups or different kind of individuals. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of things happening at that time. It's very much a complex system. So in his view, there's two types of models. So his model is a sense-making model, and whereas another type of model is a categorization model. So categorization model is where you have certain kind of categories of things, like if it has this, this, and this, then it is this. And that's where your framework precedes the data. Whereas in a sense-making model, it's the data that precedes the framework. So it's the situation where you look at the data and the actual kind of understanding of what that system is will emerge from the data. It's like grounded theory and qualitative research methods. So this is an image of that model where he has different types of systems ranging from complex to complicated to simple and chaotic, where he outlines different ways to come to an understanding. So in terms of communication, how you might go about trying to understand how best to communicate in a given situation in, say, a simple system, as you say, well, this is I'm in a fairly simple kind of social setting. I've got a logging community. I'm going to talk about sustainability. So you've got to sense, categorize, respond, right? In a seemingly simple system, right? Sense who these people are, categorize them. Okay, well, these are industry workers, and then respond with the communication strategy that you think will best work for them based on previous knowledge, right? Whereas it may not be a simple system. It may be complicated in the sense that you have a more diverse stakeholder group. So you have to then sense, analyze and say, okay, well, what's going on here? I think I see these people, and they may perceive it in this way, and these folks may perceive it in this way. I'm going to analyze these kind of potential responses, potential perceptions of the situation, the communication, and then I'm going to, okay, now I'm going to communicate in this way. So that's kind of a complicated system. Whereas a complex system, you could have multiple stakeholders in a cultural environment you're not familiar with in any way, shape, or form, and you need to then probe, so test, he argues this anyway, is to probe, so maybe do some probing questions, and sense what happens as a result of that. It's like doing an experiment, and then respond to that. So it's almost like an experiment, like a failing fast type of experiment. And then the last group there is, or type of system, is chaotic, where you have act, sense, respond, and that's where you get novel innovation, right? That's where innovation occurs, is in chaotic systems, either intentionally or not, where you act, and then as a result of your actions, say if you're innovating, right, you do it, and then you see what happens, and then you respond, and that's where you get this kind of like quick iteration over, like say we're doing a social media campaign. We push out this media, and then we see what happens. You sense what comes out of it, and then you change accordingly. So, I mean, that's just a general explanation. I'd recommend going and taking a look at some of his work here. That's one of his videos. Or if you go and Google Dave Snowden, you'll find his organization. It's just, this lecture is not really completely about that, but I think it's worth taking a look at. So the question then remains is, what has worked? So what has been effective and successful communication in the environmental field? Well, this one has got to be one of the most successful ones out there. And I think I've mentioned it before, but this is a Greenpeace campaign that was leveled against Nestle in response to their use of palm oil that was coming from a supplier that had been doing basically their business in a very unsustainable way and destroying a habitat of orangutans in Indonesia. I forget the name of the supplier, but and so Greenpeace caught wind of this and does what Greenpeace does, is they brought that issue to the forefront. And you can see here we have Nescafe, and then we have these folks who are dressed as orangutans protesting out front. And this one went viral immediately just because of the story, the visual impact. If you go through Heath's principles, you have a lot of them captured in what these folks were doing. Here we go. Killer, right? Let's just kill their own message too. Yes. I mean, yeah. Greenpeace is. I respect what they do in some cases, but I'm not a Greenpeace guy. At the end of the day, like I know I totally understand the role that Greenpeace plays and is necessary, but I'm not a supporter. You won't see me working for them. Damn, there's Nazca lines trying to get attention. Okay, what's Nazca? Oh, okay, interesting. Interesting. Okay, I didn't know that. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, they're emotive and they do stuff sometimes. I mean, these are complicated issues a lot of the time, right? Like some cases, this one was I agree with what they did here. Nestle didn't pay attention to their supply chain. They were buying palm oil from a group that was really irresponsible with what they were doing, and they deserved to be called out for it. And Greenpeace did one heck of a job of calling them out. And guess what happened? Immediate response from Nestle because they saw the impact that they're getting on the part of the negative media, and they fired that supplier, and they were one of the proponents or protagonists in the formation of the Responsible Palm Oil Organization. So a group that is trying to push for responsible palm oil production in places like in Indonesia, RSPO. Not saying everything is responsible yet, but that's what happened as a result of this very successful campaign. Like Greenpeace going into against certain kind of I don't know. I mean, protesting against harvesting of certain species and so forth without consideration of the livelihood issues of the local people and so forth. I mean, they kind of simplify issues sometimes where the issues can be a lot more complicated than just not doing that, right? Another one is Earth Hour, right? I've mentioned Earth Hour before. Goes back to credibility, exactly. So if you're not credible, you don't do your homework, then yeah, and you don't get many options. Like you don't get many chances, right? If you do something without the credibility, um, then you often won't get a second chance. Greenpeace doesn't have a lot of credibility in the environmental science world. Like Greenpeace is not going to be publishing reports on anything significant in terms of applied science or policy, and it will not be taken seriously. Whereas David Suzuki Foundation, fair enough, yeah, I would say so, relatively. WRI, absolutely. WWF, absolutely. If they publish stuff, they are credible. That's their brand. These guys, WWF, is known for credibility. And also they do really high quality work. So here's Earth Hour, and you can see the uptake that they've got on Earth Hour. Earth Hour is very successful around the world. So these shots here, we've got this left one on the left is in Indonesia, and then the one on the right is Sydney, Australia, I believe. Yeah. And you have before Earth Hour above, and then during Earth Hour. So you can see that there's a heck of a lot of people that turn off their lights in Earth Hour there. I mean, look at the city is just kind of gone black for the most part, right? Except for the big lights at the stadium and so forth. So I mean, they got credibility on that issue, and it's as simple. Like go through the list, Heath's list of characteristics. Earth Hour hits a lot of them. Here's another one from Greenpeace. I like this one. I just saw this because it's just visually compelling. It's emotive. This gets at the emotive side of things. What are we seeing here? The Amazon, or at least a representation of the Amazon, where they photoshopped this a bit, and they've created the lung of the earth, right? Yeah, and they see there that a quarter of the lung on the right-hand side has been burnt down through deforestation. So instantly the viewer, the audience, looks at this and goes, oh, the lung of the earth. We're destroying it through deforestation. Maybe we shouldn't, before it's too late, that's the message here, we should start to do something about this. Brilliant communications. Really, really, really well done. So I guess the question I have to you is, what do you think will work? So how do you think we can reconcile the imperatives for sustainability with communication? So what are the issues that you think need the most attention? Where do they need attention? And then how do we address them from a communication standpoint? Anybody? What's the one issue that you think we need to communicate the most on to mobilize action? Melting ice caps, climate change. Okay, so where does that need the most change? What is the globally? But presumably we need to focus on those that are emitting the most greenhouse gas emissions, right? Acceptance, complacency. Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. And this is coming from a guy, conservation. Yeah, conservation of biodiversity is big. In fact, I'd say my feeling is that biodiversity needs more attention than climate change. I mean, I'm not choosing one issue or the other, but I'm saying that because, I mean, we all hear about climate change. Everybody knows, even your average Joe in the street knows about that issue. Whereas, your average person does not know or care really about conservation of biodiversity and sustainable use of ecosystems, right? Whereas if you look at the data, Millennium Assessment or any of the global, like what's happening in IPBES, man, I mean, global biodiversity is like getting beat up, as is ecosystem, as our ecosystems, and that's our lifeblood. So I do think that my feeling is that we need to communicate more about conservation of biodiversity and really make that more of a tangible priority. Absolutely linked to climate change. There's no question those are not linked issues, and in fact, we should communicate them as linked issues, like communicate solutions as linked as co-benefits, right? So conserving rainforest is a co-benefit solution for both biodiversity conservation and climate change. So we're keeping carbon stored in the biosphere. Education starting with younger generations, absolutely. It's being misused by industry. It's not well understood. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of that. There's a lot of talk about that. Actually, the CBD at the meetings, there was some meetings about that. How biodiversity is just thrown around a lot, especially in industry. Whereas we need to have really kind of good, solid, credible understanding and credible programs that are actually going to have tangible benefits for biodiversity. Yeah, put out clear arguments for taxing carbon emissions and other pollution. Yes, I believe that's absolutely necessary. And I also think we need to communicate for the taxing issue. We need to communicate that, yeah, carbon taxation now is becoming a political issue in Ontario and so forth, whereas it should not be. People need to understand that carbon taxation is one of the most cost-effective ways of dealing with climate change. It's very well understood in the literature. Like, talk to any environmental economist, and they will tell you straight up that taxation is the cost-effective way to dealing with climate change. I mean, however, the counter argument to that is, from a voter standpoint, is that my gas is going to be more expensive, right? Greater cost from you, and that's the idea. The idea is to reduce consumption, right? So some people don't want to be confronted with that. And look at BC. BC's carbon tax has been a success. So yeah, I'd say climate change, biodiversity. Those are issues. So I mean, how do we address them? I think I think we need to look at being creative. We also need to look at some things that have worked, right? So what's going to be the next sticky idea for biodiversity? I'm curious to know what that is. How are you going to make biodiversity stick? Well, let's look at. I think we need to draw some insights from the Heath brothers' work. It would be something that I would do. In fact, I'll be doing that for this presentation next week. It's great because actually this kind of I'll be back to it. It's not relatable. What's not relatable? Stop using plastics. Yes. Yep. Plastics. I agree with that. Ah, yes. Okay. Yeah, that's the problem with biodiversity. It's abstract. So here's my solution, Sean, to that. And this is, I've said the same thing to the folks at the CBD. Is you're not. I don't think you're going to get people on biodiversity alone. Like, I really don't think so. I've tried it, and pitched Bombardier, right, the plane company. Myself and Dave Stuerman, a colleague of mine from the UN CBD, we pitched them on business and biodiversity, bring biodiversity into their supply chain, and they just looked at us blankly, right? Like, we don't get it, like, we build planes, right? So what's the connection with? We're struggling here with the connection. So my solution to that is to try and make it a little more relatable to people. And the way that I've been able to, I think, have had some success with that is to use ecosystems. So what I do if I'm talking about business and biodiversity or business and nature at all, I use ecosystem services as kind of the factor we need to think about and kind of be stewards of. Because then you can relate those ecosystem services to things that we, in a business case, things that we rely on to, to function. Yes, exactly. I mean, yeah, that's These could be it. But piggyback the issue on something more relatable, yes. So water ecosystem services, right? So this is what I use quite often because people get that. Companies get the water ecosystem service always because they know they need it, or cotton, or food production, or whatever. But then you build onto that, you build into that biodiversity as kind of this latent part of ecosystems that supports it. It's the kind of the base, the bank of genetic material that is the base for ecosystems, which therefore then provides ecosystem services. That's kind of how I've gotten at it and got people interested, like banks, for instance, and so forth. And thus far, it's been kind of successful. Indices for showing ecological degradation in our economy, absolutely. I'm also interested in actually having legitimate ecological data or environmental data tied to economic valuation. So that could be some form of that, and this is what I'm working on right now. Actually, like building systems like this system in St. Lucia, we're gathering a lot of environmental data that we put in an integrated repository where we can see it time change. We can see like change in time of land cover and so forth. But what I want to look is indices and indicators, which is what we have established already, that show change in these indicators, and then link those to ecosystem health, but also to economic activity. And this is where you get into like legitimate environmental economics. That's kind of my midterm plan for the stuff I'm working on. So that's it. We're at an hour. So kind of to wrap things up, I would say communication is a fundamentally important part of this challenge that we have. I think it would be worth your time to take a look at Chip and Dan, I think their names are, the Heath brothers. Take a look at their work. You don't necessarily need to go buy the book, but it's in the library. Go grab it. And I'd recommend definitely, just one sec, I'm going to show it quickly. They have this thing you can download. You go to their website. I'm just going to send this through right now. So if you go here, you can put your email in, and then it will register you with their, I mean, they want your email so they can email you stuff and so forth, which is great. I mean, their stuff's good, so it's actually could be beneficial for you. But that will then allow you to download what they call the made to stick model, which I kind of explained here, which is their 6 principles and then how those roll out. But it's good to look at their, their explanation of the specifics of each one of those principles, and then try and relate them to what you're working on. Make sense? All right. Any questions? The impact that I've had by investing in communication on projects has been make or break. For me, for instance, I will bring Lisa. Lisa is the art director for DE. We will bring Lisa in on even projects that you would think you don't need to have a good graphic designer on, but you put them on there anyway and make stuff look awesome and aesthetic. It just has a huge impact. It really does. People will respond positively to something that's cleanly laid out, or evocative in terms of emotive in the imagery and so forth. I mean, it has a massive, massive impact. Sticky approach is very similar to some of the TED Talks I've seen. In how they've delivered the TED Talks, you mean? Yes. Well, I'm sure a lot of TED speakers have read their book, because they want their TED Talk to be sticky. So they're going to use a lot of those principles. Yeah. I mean, this isn't new. This is not new stuff. This has been around for a few years at least, and it's popular stuff too. So, yeah. I'd like to see it used more often. You know, I'd like to see politicians or leaders use this and give better presentations than these kind of a cassette. You know, here you go, press play, blah 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 blah. Give something unexpected. One of the things that Donald Trump, believe it or not, is very successful at is using the the unexpected card of Heath's model, to a fault, really. But I mean, it works tremendously well for him in getting people's attention. You know, he comes out and says, you know, the completely non-intuitive thing, often in an offhanded way. But I mean, that's this that gets people's attention. You know, so you give him credit for that for sure. Yes, that's where he falls down because he speaks with credibility on issues that he does not know about, right? Yes. So, good point. You can get people's attention, but be sure to actually know what you're doing and also do it in with good and, I mean, ideally noble intentions. Yeah, I'm not so familiar with Bill Nye, honestly. Like, I know there's been a lot of hype and stuff about him, but I don't know. I can't comment on Bill Nye. Honestly, I don't think I've ever watched anything he's produced. Um, David Suzuki, fantastic. Neil deGrasse Tyson does the same. Don't know that person either. Suzuki. So David Suzuki, I had a bit of a problem with him for quite a while because I was raised reading his books and seeing his shows, and you know, typical BC kid. But then a bunch of when I went to Royal Roads a long time ago, was doing my undergrad. Some of the colleagues at Cedar had worked in collaboration with David Suzuki and had not had positive experiences. Some people that I knew did not have good experiences. I heard a lot of kind of just stories that weren't good, not the kind of things you want to hear about something like that. Nothing like terrible, but just a kind of ego, like big shot type stuff. However, so I was like, you know, because I'd read The Sacred Balance and It's a Matter of Time and you name it, and all great stuff. So I really, you know, have a lot of time for that. Then last year, I saw him speak at SFU for a session that had been organized on re-examining the Canadian Constitution in light of sustainability. So they had John Borrows was speaking via Skype. They had Joel Backen, the guy who wrote The Corporation. He was one of the speakers. A couple people there from organizations in Vancouver, the Downtown East Side organizations, and so forth. And then David Suzuki came as well, and they had a First Nations elder. And David Suzuki delivered a talk there that just like was a barn burner, like just really, really fantastic. And ever since then, after seeing that, I thought, you know what, this guy is just like he's the OG, he's the original guy. Now you may not agree with like he's some of the ideas are a little kind of unrealistic, perhaps, even though what he presented there was unrealistic. He was talking about returning to a time where, you know, um, we did everything according to traditional ways in the Lower Mainland, and it's like it's not going to happen. Like we've developed, so we need to, you know, manage our development in a sustainable way. But you know, he was taking kind of the romantic vision of what things used to be like, and borrowed territory, which is all true. But it just was like I was left asking, okay, well, so what do we do then? But the presentation he gave was fantastic, and he called out the government too on stuff, which I thought was, you know, it took courage to do that, right? He could have quite easily just towed the line and said, "Oh, everything's great," you know, federally, whereas he you know he called a spade, and I was really impressed, to be honest with you. Another issue when heroes fall, so does the cause. Okay, like what? Give me an example. I agree with you, but I want to like what would be an example of that? like say for instance, when it's resting with that individual. How about like Jacques Cousteau, right? Jacques Cousteau died of old age or what have you. And although his memory lives on, I don't think it's quite the same. I've heard his grandson does the touring now and speaking, but it's not the same. Well, I was going to say Steve Irwin. That was the other one I was thinking about. But his kids are pretty phenomenal. Have you seen his kids? His daughter is like, Bindi. There we go. Yeah, I mean, she's kind of carrying the torch. You know, those are the most positive kids I think I've ever seen in my life. It's almost creepy. They're so positive and energetic. It's like wow. Like I don't mean to degrade or in any way, shape, or form like you know, demote what they're doing. They're great, but it's like I was guru positivity. They're just, I mean, maybe I was a little more of a badass when I was a kid. Anyway, they're great. I think Steve Irwin's legacy will live on. His kids are doing a good job. Um, sure. Yeah. No, it's legitimate for sure. All right, guys. I'm gonna call it a night because it's 11:10 here in Montreal, and things still need to get it done for tomorrow. All right. Well, thanks for coming out, and we'll see you guys on the discussion board. And we will close with this. Yes. Fleetwood Mac. Two classics, Pixies and Fleetwood Mac. What you know